Hi, everyone. This is your second lecture. It's really just meant to be an introduction to art history in general and some of the key terminology that is used in art history and what we call methodology, various approaches for interpreting works of art. And again, I'm not going to try to talk about every single in and out of the discipline of art history or what all the terminology is here today. All I want to do is give you a brief introduction because I know that many people don't know what art history is or what it does or why it might be interesting. So that's really what this is all about. If you haven't already done it, you'll always see before these content-based lectures a little link, that is a lecture guide. So print out the lecture guide or at least open it up and take a look over it. I do not caption my slides, right? So I won't be putting the names of works of art on my slides, nor do I, generally speaking, put the terminology on the image. It's all going to be on your lecture guide. So generally speaking, I think it's a very good idea to download those, print them out. They're Word documents, so you can always download them and then just insert your notes into the actual lecture guide document. Save you a little bit of time with those titles and key terminology, which will be on that. In any case, on this one, this lecture guide, basically what I'm doing is giving you some of the key terminology again at the top, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the methodologies that will be employed in this class to come to an understanding of what these works of art are all about and how they're related to their context. So one of the ways that I like to start off talking about art history is to just say works of art, those things that we call works of art, paintings, sculptures, figurines, pottery, whatever we want to use to say this is the work of art. They are all produced in particular time periods, and they look the way that they do in large part because they are reflecting or representing some of the larger beliefs of the time period in which they were produced. A good way to think about this is that an artist is a product of their age as well. And those artists are influenced by what's going on in the world around them, what the key religious belief systems are, the political situation, what is fashionable at the time, what the ideological assumptions of a particular time period might be. They're products of their own age. And when they create works of art, those things that have influenced them are going to show up in the work of art in the way that it looks, in the subject matter that is chosen, and so forth. Now, you don't need to remember any of the names of these works of art that I'm going to show you or any of the artists. Most of them don't have anything to do with the history of American art anyway. I just want to take you through some basic ideas here. So let me do this really simply here, and then I will backtrack and go through it a little bit more systematically. What we have in front of us here on the screen is the subject, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And this is a subject that was very popular in Western Europe, particularly from the time period of the Renaissance forward. It's a key symbol for Christians about the sacrifice of someone they believe to be the Messiah for the sins of mankind. It's something that was important to a lot of people during particular time periods, right? That in itself is something that I'll come back to, like why are they drawn to particular subjects at particular times? But what I'm more concerned with here is making you think about something that will be a big part of this course, which is how does the way that this particular artist was influenced by their time period, what's going on in the historical context when they're producing art, how does that show up in the visual form of the work of art itself, right? Why does he represent it this way rather than some other way? Again, we know this. We think about this all the time. A good way to be thinking about, how we can have something that is basically the same subject, the crucifixion, show up and look different over and over again, is to think a little bit about, let's say, music. And if you've ever had a favorite song, you just love that song, and then it gets remade, and you're like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that, I don't know, trying not to offend anyone, Justin Bieber remade my favorite Metallica song or something like that. It's the same words, it's the same tones, but it's really not the same song. Or another example of this is if you've ever had a favorite book and you just love that book, and then big Hollywood remakes the book and it's just the worst movie you've ever seen, and it feels like they ruined your favorite book. Those are the same subject, but they're being told differently by different artists in different ways for different reasons. And a big part of art history is about thinking about how a particular subject is told differently or represented differently by different artists, and how those differences in one way or another are products of what was going on at the time in that particular culture or society, what we call the historical context. So, for instance, here in visual form, as we see this crucifixion, and if you think a little bit about what a crucifixion would be, I mean, it's someone, in this case, nailed to a cross after having the holy crud beaten out of them. And we see it here and we're like, sorry, but it doesn't look that bad, frankly. Jesus looks pretty darn good. It doesn't make crucifixion look like such a bad thing. Why? Why would they represent it this way rather than another way, right? What's going on at the time? Now, I'm not here to answer that question for you today because this work of art isn't a part of our course, but it is something that can raise that question. So if I then say, here's another crucifixion by a different artist who's in a little bit different part of Italy, but it's a work of art that was produced at exactly the same time, you can see that doesn't look like the same story. It's emphasizing different things. It's got the same subject matter. It's still a crucifixion, but it's being told differently. Or, put these side by side. How about this one? Move a little bit further north. Now we're in the area of Germany, a little bit later in time than the first two crucifixions I showed you, telling the story a little bit differently, emphasizing, in this case, the human anguish of Christ rather than maybe exalting or glorifying his sacrifice for us, right? Why does the artist tell the story this way rather than another way? Something that's going on in this society at that time will influence the artist to tell the story or represent this subject matter in a slightly different way. A little bit earlier on, right, the crucifixion looks different, doesn't it? Or this one. Or this one. Or this one, right? Same subject matter told differently. Our, again, let's say, emphasis will be what's going on in the world at this time that influences the artist in a particular way to respond to the subject matter in a particular way, anticipating that the public will want to see it this way, or will be excited to see it this way, or will be, let's say, even shocked to see it this way, right? We're looking at how these things function within the societies that produce them. Jumping forward in time, Salvador Dali's crucifixion, not quite the same story, is it? Or Pablo Picasso's crucifixion, I guess. I mean, who knows? That's what he called it anyway, right? Why does he tell the story in this modern abstract way? Or Francis Bacon, a little bit later than that, telling the story of the crucifixion in his own particular way, right? So one of the things that art history does then is to analyze these visual representations, these works of art within their historical and cultural context to come to some kind of understanding about how they represent some of the core beliefs and ideological assumptions, spiritual traditions, political upheavals, and so forth of the time periods in which they were produced. But to get to that, we have to talk about some of the key terminology that will be employed in this class. Sometimes more, sometimes less. Sometimes, we don't have time to visually analyze everything in a lecture, but I do want you to have this terminology under your belt before we even get started with the class. So on your lecture guide for today, you see right at the top, formal or visual elements of art. The formal or visual elements of art are what you can break a work of art down into. And I'm really going to be emphasizing painting here because painting is the major art form that we'll be looking at in this class. So if you look at a painting, one of the first things, or a drawing, one of the first things you can start talking about are all the little component parts of the painting. It's made up of colors and lines and shapes and illusions of space, right? Subject matter, what it represents, and so forth. And what we're doing here now is giving names to that, building a shared terminology around that. So lines. We know what lines are, right? Lines are used to make up lots of works of art. The first thing I want you to be thinking about is that there are a couple of different kinds of lines. There are actual lines. These are lines like contour lines that bound the edge of a three-dimensional object. There are outlines. Those are the lines that you draw around the contours of something, but they look more two-dimensional. And there are something known as implied lines. So if you look on the left-hand side under actual lines, you see what we might call real lines. These are lines that actually are lines. If you look on the right-hand side, we have what are called implied lines. They're the kinds of lines that are achieved when I point at something and your eye goes from that finger to what I'm pointing at. There's no actual line there, but there's a kind of line of sight. Or if you look at these dots all in a row, or dashes all in the row, or the tops of all of those vertical lines in a row, there appears to be a line that connects them all together, right? That's what we call an implied line. Implied lines are used by artists to point towards things, to make points of emphasis, for instance. The other thing I want to talk about, though, with lines and with all the formal elements, the basic building blocks of any art form, color, line, shape, texture, and so forth, is that lines and colors and shapes have what we call a particular quality or particular effect. So if you look at, in particular, these actual lines, a very standard straight line versus a curvy line versus a jagged line versus a larger curvy line versus a line that's made up of all these little cutting movements of a pencil, those all feel a little bit different. They all have a different impact on us. They're going to affect us in different ways. Let's say, and this is just a for instance, let's say an artist wants to create something that's calm and soothing. They'll use a continuous long curving line, right? They want to create something that's very stable. They'll set up a composition that has a lot of lines that are verticals and horizontals that feel like they're stable. If they want to create a composition or a work of art that has a lot of energy, they'll use a lot of diagonal lines or a lot of lines that change direction a lot. These are just ways that an artist can tell their story through not just the subject matter, but the formal elements and the choices they make about how to represent that subject matter. So then, let's take a for instance. This is a work by Francisco Goya. Again, you don't need to remember any of these works of art. They're not a part of the course. They're just basically visual aids for me to help explain something. One thing that I can talk about right off the bat that we've just talked about are lines, right? There are contour lines around the edges of these figures and the various shapes, but there are also implied lines from the edges of the bayonets on the rifles that point towards that central character in the middle. We look at those rifles, they point towards that central character, we look at him and we say, oh, there's a point of emphasis, something that they want us to look at, right? That's the way implied lines work, or one of the ways that it works. Now let's transition into color. Obviously, in paintings, unless they're monochromatic, you're going to get a lot of color. Some sculptures actually put some color on the sculpture as well. Here we have basic, what are called analogous colors, and then we have a couple of intense colors, colors that stand out. The yellows and the reds really are more intense, meaning, or more saturated. They have more yellow, right? They feel stronger than, let's say, the muted blues that are in the dress of the first soldier in front of us. That red looks very red, and we call that, when it's intense, either an intense color or a saturated color. And you can see how it draws our eye to it. So what's going on then with color? What's some of the terminology? This is your basic color wheel, right? And just so you know, these basic things that will come up or be presumed that you have knowledge of in the lecture, in terms of pigmented color, meaning painting color, where an artist mixes together different colors to get other colors, we always start with 3 primary colors, right? From these colors, theoretically anyway, you can make all other colors. And those 3 primary colors, as you see here, are yellow, blue, and red. So that's what we call primary color. Secondary colors are what you get when you mix together primary colors. So if I mix together yellow and red, I get orange. If I mix together red and blue, I get purple. And if I mix together yellow and blue, I get green. And these are called secondary colors, right? I'm not going to be using those terms a lot. What I really want you to take away from color is this. Colors that are on the yellow through the red end of the spectrum are what are known as warm colors. Warm colors tend to expand. They feel like they're expanding, and they tend to assert themselves, like stand out. It's one of the reasons we use red on a stop sign or yellow as a caution sign. They tend to feel like they're standing out or advancing towards us and expanding. So you can imagine how an artist would, let's say, use those colors in order to impact us. Colors on the other end of the spectrum, in the green through the purple end of the spectrum, are what are known as cool colors. And not surprising, their effects are about the opposite of warm colors. They feel like they're contracting, and they feel like they're receding from us. So that if you want to minimize, let's say, the impact of something, you want it to look further away, you want it to look like it's contracting, an artist is more likely to use those cool colors. Now, the other thing that's going on in this color wheel is you see the term complementary color. A complementary color has to do with a color combination. So that if I put a blue against an orange, that is what's called complementary colors. Complementary colors actually intensify each other. So that if I put blue against orange, and you'll notice that a lot of, let's say, sports teams use complementary colors, it's going to look incredibly intense. The blue is going to look more blue, the orange look even more orange. If I'm trying to create a work of art that's full of a lot of energy, I will use a lot of complementary colors. And again, it's a color combination. So colors that are basically across from each other on the color wheel, blue and orange, green and red, yellow and purple, and so forth, are what are known as complementary colors. They complement each other. They make each other look even more yellow, more purple, and so forth. Colors that are next to each other on the color wheel, so various shades of green, will be what are known as analogous colors. Analogous colors harmonize. Analogous colors go together with one another. If I want to create a very soothing composition or a soothing painting, I'm going to use a lot of analogous colors. Colors, by the way, I just use the term color, but you'll every once in a while come across art historians who insist upon using the term hue. Hue is just another term for what we call a color, right? Spatial qualities. Spatial qualities in works of art. I'm going to jump forward here for a minute. Oops, what's going on here? Spatial qualities in works of art are, again, if we're talking about a painting, basically ways that an artist can arrange the space of a painting and create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. So right now, I just want to give you some of the terminology and explain what that means. When we look at Francisco Goya, the 3rd of May, 1808 here, it looks partially illusionistic. It looks like there's some three-dimensional space here, right? One of the reasons that we see space here is that the artist has used what's called overlapping. So follow my cursor here. If I look at this soldier here in the foreground, he appears to be in front of this soldier here and this soldier here because the artist has overlapped these forms. We know that a painting is a two-dimensional surface, but by making this figure that's apparently in front of the other figure overlap or obscure part of them, the artist creates the illusion of three dimensions. Another way an artist creates the illusion of three dimensions is through what's known as size diminution. It's a fancy word to say that things that are closer to us appear larger and things that are further away appear smaller. So if an artist creates, as he does here, a figure who is on his knees but looks bigger than this figure here a little bit further in the background, you're going to understand that this figure that's bigger is closer. And then follow my cursor again. These little huddled figures way back here who look so small, they're smaller because, again, the artist wants us to think and is able to convince us that they're further away. Converging lines are another way that an artist creates the illusion of three-dimensional space. I presume many of you, when you were a kid, learned that the way to make a railroad track look like it's going off into the distance is to make those lines that are parallel converge towards each other. And that will create the illusion of three dimensions. When an artist systematizes that, in other words, they basically use some rules to create the illusion of converging lines, we call that linear perspective. Here's an example of how linear perspective works. So we'll start over here on the right-hand side. This line is what's known as a horizon line. Again, I will pick this up when it's appropriate later on in the lectures. This is just meant to be a little primer for you. That horizon line, if we were creating a landscape painting, would be right where the sky meets the land, or where, let's say, the sea meets the sky. But it's the theoretical eye level that a viewer sees a scene from. Along that horizon line is what, in linear one-point perspective, is called the vanishing point. And here, if you follow my cursor, that vanishing point is right here on that horizon line. And when the artist wants to create these box forms in the foreground, you'll notice that the edges of these boxes all recede back to that vanishing point. That's how linear one-point perspective is used. Probably all tried to do this before. You create a cube or the front of a box, and then you're trying to figure out how to do the sides of the box. Well, in linear one-point perspective, those sides all recede back to one central vanishing point. If, however, you've got a box form and its leading edge here, follow my cursor, is pointed towards you, you can't use linear perspective, or a linear one-point perspective anymore. You need to use something called linear two-point perspective. And here you see that there's a point along this horizon line on both edges to which the sides of these boxes converge. Again, this is just to give you some shared terminology. I'm not going to ask you to draw in linear one or two-point perspective. I want you to know what these terms are. When they come up later on in the lectures, we'll explain why they're significant and why an artist might employ this rather than just an unsystematized converging line. So then, for instance here, this is a painting by an Impressionist painter, Gustave Caillebotte, called Paris Rainy Day. Don't need to remember that again. And maybe you can see it and maybe you can't, but the artist has used both linear one and two-point perspective in this to generate the buildings and make them appear convincing. Here's that diagram, right? So in this case, the 1 point of 1 point perspective is on this horizon line, and it generates the sidewalk. And two-point perspective is used to generate this building over here. It's just a way that the artist can create that illusion of three-dimensionality. I'm going to pause here for a minute. You'll see a little blip, and I'll be right back. Okay, you'll see that kind of happen periodically when I'm giving lectures, when I have to pause because my throat's dry or I've gotten a phone call and forgot to turn off my phone or whatever. In a, let's say, a class that I had more time to compose my lectures, I would edit these things out, but this quarter, bear with me a little bit here. So again, back to ways that artists can create the illusion of three-dimension on a two-dimensional surface, or the spatial qualities of works of art. We've talked about overlapping. We've talked about size diminution. You can see that here. These characters in the foreground are larger, and then as they get further away, they get smaller, convincing us that this is three-dimensional. We've talked about using converging lines and linear perspective, in this case, 2- and 1-point perspective. There's a couple other things going on here that are worth pointing out. One is that one of the ways that an artist can create the illusion of three-dimensionality is through something known as atmospheric perspective. And we actually see this here. Atmospheric perspective is based upon the principle that between you and things that are further away, there's more particulate in the atmosphere. And what that does is obscure things that are further away. Artists will therefore make things that are further away lose detail and lose color. And you can see that here on the face of this building, lots and lots of detail. As it gets further away, less and less detail. Or the cobblestones here, which have tons of detail in the foreground, and as they get further away, have less and less detail. Also, a part of spatial qualities, things that are closer to us are in the foreground. In this case, we call things that are right in the immediate foreground, the foreground, things that are in the middle of the picture, the middle ground, and things that are in the deep background, the background, right? Easy enough to remember there. This is where it gets a little bit trickier. There's a term used in both in film, but also in arts, particularly painting, called the picture plane. Picture plane is notoriously difficult to explain, or for some people to understand, but a picture plane is the imaginary barrier that separates you from the scene of the painting. It's not the actual surface of the painting itself. It's like, imagine you're looking at this painting and it's as if you're looking through a window onto the street scene. That window pane would be the picture plane. And the reason that this is a useful term is I can say these figures are really close to the picture plane, or these people are walking out of the picture plane. Those are further away from the picture plane, right? It's not the literal surface of the canvas. It's actually this plane that separates us from the scene that's going around there. The ground plane, as you might imagine, is the ground on which the figures are walking or standing or resting, or a building is set, and so forth. We've already talked about the subject matter of a painting, but let's clarify this. When someone says the subject of a painting or subject matter of the painting, at the basic level, they're talking about, in a representational painting, what you can recognize. So here, the subject matter is people walking on a street in a rainy day, holding umbrellas, again, cobblestone streets, buildings, right? That's the basic level of subject matter. When it's a representational subject, meaning you can recognize what you're looking at, it's what you see. There are other levels of subject matter, though, too, that are worth emphasizing here. In this painting, to go one step further, because we know the title, we could say, or we recognize the buildings or what people are wearing, we can say this is Paris in the middle of the 19th century during a rainy day. So you could add that one little extra level of detail. Sometimes, however, subject matter is meant to be a kind of allegory of something else. Not here, but in many cases, let's say religious subject matter, you might see as we saw at the beginning of this lecture, someone hanging on a cross, and your first thing would be, when talking about subject matter, this is someone who's being crucified. But the next level to that subject matter, oftentimes called iconography, I save that term for something else, but oftentimes you'll hear it used that way, is recognizing that that figure on the cross is not just any figure on the cross, that's a representation of Jesus Christ on the cross. I'll come back to that in a minute. So subject matter is different than content or the meaning of a work of art, right? What the artist is trying to say through the subject matter and through the way that they represent that subject matter by making various choices about colors and shapes and, frankly, everything that has to do with a formal element is what adds up to the content or the meaning of a work of art. We also have to talk about things known as iconography or symbolism in works of art. Iconography literally means picture writing. So it's everything in addition to what you actually see represented. So for instance here, and by the way, I use it synonymously with symbolism, right? So iconography, picture writing, symbolism, they're basically the same thing. So here, what you see it's a portrait of two characters. It's called the Arnolfini Devil Portrait by Jan van Eyck. And at the basic level, the subject matter is a couple of people in an interior with a dog, a bed, a chandelier, a mirror, and so forth. But there's another level to this subject matter, right? What does it represent? Well, if we know about marital practices, we know we're looking at a marriage. That's also the subject. And if we know about symbolism, you know that this work is filled with symbols, so that everything you look at is symbolic of something else. Symbols are a matter of cultural convention. You have to know that people of a particular time period believed that a certain object, or in this case, for instance, the dog, represents something more than just a dog. It represents an idea. In this case, the dog in the foreground here represents fidelity, because dogs are notoriously faithful to their masters. And fidelity was a big idea, of course, associated with marriage. To go back and explain this again, symbols don't have any innate meaning to them. They're matters of cultural convention. So that if you think of all the symbols that you're aware of, like the peace sign, for instance, you had to learn that that peace sign means peace. Symbols work that way. So for instance, here's a couple of other symbols. Follow my cursor. In this beautiful chandelier, there's only one candle. One candle at the time lit meant that something holy or something legal was happening. Over on her side is a broom and a figurine of the patron saint of women in marriage. This has to do with her role in the marriage, taking care of the house, producing children. On his side is an open window, symbolic of his realm, which is out there in the larger world. We talked about the dog. The mirror in the background, along with being a cool way for the artist to show you this entire scene from the back to the front, again, it's a great painting, is also symbolic of the eye of God, witnessing all things. The fact that they're not wearing shoes and they're standing directly on the ground is symbolic of standing on holy ground, meaning something religious is occurring here, and on and on and on. Symbols, again, are used by artists to various degrees in various time periods, and once you understand what that symbol is meant to represent, if you're in the same culture, it's going to be a symbol that you'll be able to recognize over and over in front of works of art. So symbols can gain or give meaning to works of art as well. It's a good point to talk about style. In the American Art Survey, we don't talk a ton about style, but you should know what style means. In art history, a style, or a period style, is a more specific way to designate it, is a series of characteristics that works of art produced roughly during the same time period in the same culture will share in common. So we talk about, for instance, the Renaissance style, or we talk about the Baroque style, or Romantic style, or Classical style. And the reason that we use style is to be able to designate a series of characteristics that particular art will have during a particular time period in a particular culture. We'll be doing less of this in the American Art Survey, but we will be talking about big genres and time periods that share things in common. So for instance here, what you're looking at is an American landscape painting by Albert Bierstadt. It's called Rocky Mountains Landers Peak. And we'll be talking about, in one of our lectures fairly early on in the quarter, what landscape painting meant to people at this time period in the United States, why they chose to represent it, and so forth. So we're talking about it as a genre that has a lot of things in common, or that artists are responding to in various different ways. In this painting, we can also talk about style being a way of representing a subject matter. This is what's known as a representational style. And most of the art that you'll be seeing, almost all of it, up until the beginning of the 20th century anyway, will be representational styles. Meaning, as you can imagine, I can understand what the artist is showing me by recognizing it. I know that what I'm looking at are horses, Native Americans, teepees, trees, mountains, a lake, and so forth. It's a representational style. If something is non-representational or completely abstract, all bets are off. The artist is just using lines and colors and shapes and so forth. But that doesn't happen until near the end of our quarter. However, within representational styles, we also have to talk about some other specific terms. Just because I can recognize this or call it a representational style doesn't mean that I'm done talking about style here. This painting is also known as naturalistic. Naturalistic is a term used by art historians to designate things that look like real things but may have been slightly changed by the artist for various reasons. So in this case, this looks like a mountain, it looks like a lake, it looks like trees, but the artist isn't confining himself to just representing exactly what he sees. Instead, he's changing that for various reasons, maybe to make it look better, maybe because, a tree was dead over here and he just takes it out, maybe because any number of factors. Naturalism means a style that looks realistic, but isn't naturally or isn't beholden to the way something really looked. If Albert Bierstadt went out and he saw Landers Peak and he painted everything exactly the way that he saw it without changing anything, he's trying to be as accurate as possible to what he sees in front of him, we would call that realistic. Very few artists want to be realistic. Most want to just be naturalistic, to change things, to make the picture more pleasing, to make it communicate some message that they want to get across more clearly, and so forth. Another thing that, another stylistic within representational art is what we call idealization. So let's say that in this case, Albert Bierstadt saw Rocky Mountain Landers Peak, but it wasn't that cool at all, and he wanted to make it look better, and he recomposes the picture, changes the way that it looks to make everything look bigger and brighter and more vibrantly green, and corresponds the way that he represents the subject with what is seen to be better. That's what we call idealization, right? You're trying to idealize it. You're trying to make it look better than it actually is. There's another term that's, I don't want to get us too confused about, but it's called stylizing. Let's say a particular style is really in vogue or really popular at a time that wants everything to be a little bit more, day glow green, or everything be a little bit flatter than it really is. And artists might submit what they see to the prevailing tastes of the time, and we would call that stylized. We'll get to these terms, and if some of this is confusing to you now, don't worry. I'm just introducing them. We'll pick them up as the lectures go on when they are appropriate. What else do I want to talk about here? Well, we might as well go into, well, let's do this. So this is also a landscape, right? This is Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night. Most of you are familiar with it. It's a more abstract style. It's still something that is representational, meaning I can tell that that's a sky and those are stars and a planet, probably Venus, way off to the right-hand side. I can tell that there's a landscape down below, right? But it's probably not the way that Vincent van Gogh saw that sky and saw that landscape. He's changed what he saw for various reasons. He's abstracted it, simplified it, manipulated it. When an artist is painting things in the colors and the shapes that they see it, we call those colors local colors, meaning if you want to depict a tree and you make it look green, it's because the tree is green. We call that local. If you change it, exaggerate it, right? Make it more green or turn it red, as you can probably barely see here in the big cypress tree in the foreground. Those are what we call non-local colors. So every time that we see an artist making decisions about changing something from what it really originally looked like, we want to ask questions about why they would do that, what that was supposed to mean, what are they trying to communicate. It's worth keeping in mind that with very few exceptions, artists didn't see their job as representing the world as it actually looked to them. They're not trying to be realistic. There's nothing to be gained to be realistic. They're trying to be artistic. They're trying to communicate something more than just the way that something looks. So let's round this brief intro out with a few things about context and methodology, right? So at the bottom of your lecture guide, you see general art historical methodological approaches or methodologies. One of the things that you would do anytime you look at works of art, and we do it less in art history classes than we do it in real life, is to say, number one, let's assess what the physical properties of this work of art are. Right? How big is it? What is it made out of? What's its materials? How did the artist create this, and so forth? The materials, by the way, that a work of art is made out of are what are known as its medium or its media. So in this case, the media of this painting it's an oil painting on canvas. That's the media. It's a very, very big painting. Generally speaking, the bigger something is, the more important it was meant to be, the more monumental. It may even tell us something about where it was originally meant to be exhibited and so forth. That's just a basic kind of starting point. And frankly, in this class, we don't spend a ton of time on that. Second, we want to analyze the formal structure of the work of art, or the formal elements, in other words. We want to basically break a work of art down into these little formal building blocks and say, what effect are they having on us here? So, for instance, here is that you see a lot of really long, continuous curving lines, not a ton of jagged lines, especially in the foreground. Those are soothing. You also notice that most of the colors are what we call analogous colors. They're close to each other on the color wheel, right? So those are also going to harmonize with one another and be soothing. We see a composition, and composition means the way that the picture is organized, that is very symmetrical. You can almost cut it right down in the middle and have equal weight on both sides, right? And that tends to feel very, again, familiar and comfortable to us. We'll pick this up as the class goes along. And you can keep going through this, right? We have all those spatial systems set up here. You see the atmospheric perspective. The mountains that are further away from us are, blurring into the landscape. Blurring into the sky. They don't look as detailed as things that are in the foreground and so forth. What are the effects of these formal elements? Well, there's a lot of things that are harmonizing here. We see how everything is pushed back from the picture plane so that we are given a stance of kind of observing comfortably what we see in front of us, right? So The second level to analyzing works of art is asking questions about why did the artist represent it this way? And what do we mean by those different ways of representing it? Why did he represent this so soothing, so calming, so majestic with this, again, hovering very symmetrical Lander's Peak above us? Why was he doing that? We already know about identifying subject matter, but let's go a little bit further here. Number 3 in our methodology is, what are we actually seeing? Does what we're seeing correspond to what was going on at the time? And in this case, it just so happens that Lander's Peak here, right in the center, doesn't look like what Lander's Peak really looks like. He's exaggerated it. He actually made it look like the Matterhorn in the Alps, because he was German born and that was the coolest mountain that anyone had represented at the time. And because this was being painted out in the West where very few people had ever even visited, he thought he could get away with it and make it look like we had an even greater mountain than we really had, right? Another thing to point out is, so we know the subject matter here, we can pick out trees and so forth, but another level of subject matter is, who are these people we see in the foreground? Well, with a little bit of research, we're able to find out this is a Shoshone encampment. And so we know who these people are. We can do a little bit more research and say, is this accurate? Is this what the teepees that Shoshone lived in really looked like? Is this their way of life? Does this correspond? And where it does, great. And where it doesn't, we have to ask, why did the artist represent it in the way that they did? The big thing, though, and the thing that I'm most concerned with in this class, is asking how all of these questions go together. In other words, why did the artist represent this subject matter in this particular way at this particular time, integrating into the context the work of art? So in this case, the brief story is something like this. When Albert Bierstadt painted this, it was right on the verge of the Indian Wars. We had already been moving Native Americans or American Indians onto reservations since the 1830s. There were tons of conflicts with them, right? So this was a way for the artist to represent Native American cultures persevering further out west. What did the landscape mean to people at the time? Well, again, we'll pick this up when we get to the lecture, but this isn't just a beautiful landscape. For people in the United States during the 19th century, the beautiful, pristine landscape of North America was something that separated us from every other culture that we were in competition with, particularly the Europeans. In other words, the landscape was part of our national identity. It was something that meant a whole host of things. For some, it was a manifestation of the divine, something known as pantheism. For others, it was endless natural resources that would contribute to the progress of American prosperity. For others, for instance, here, worried about the way that we were decimating native populations of North America, it was the promise of a place that everyone could live together in harmony, where there was enough room and enough land for everyone. In other words, this work of art is not just a beautiful landscape. It meant something to the people of the time that we will be analyzing, we will be exploring, we will be kind of reaching back into the past to learn something about the history of the United States through these visual works of art. Again, this is just meant to be a kind of, here's some of the terminology, so that when it comes across in a lecture for the first time, you can be like, oh, this is the second time I've heard this. Some of the more complex terms that I've talked about today, and certainly the methodology, will be things that I go into much more detail about in the actual content-based lectures themselves. Well, thanks for listening. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, move on to the next module, which is the first content-based lecture of the course, where we'll be looking into early portraiture, or portraiture through the mid-19th century.